Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. In this video specifically we are going to spend some time talking about Charles I and his Petition of Right, which was made or issued to him in 1628. We'll talk about the origins and the historical context associated with the Petition of Right before thinking about how this petition was drafted, the role of certain key figures and authors in its drafting. We'll look at what some of these key petition provisions were, and we'll talk about what the royal response was. All part of this broader conversation that we're going to be having towards the relationship between the monarch and Parliament. So in terms of the historical context, we could argue that there are arguably two main issues that concerns the Petition of Right. We have the issuance of financial strains and forced loans, and we have the imposition of martial law and a practice known as billeting of troops. So let's begin with the first of these. When we think about the financial strains, upon ascending to the throne in 1625, Charles I inherited quite a lot of ongoing conflicts with Parliament. In a previous lesson, we talked about the Happy Parliament, which was this sort of the final point at which James, the father of Charles, had somewhat cordial relationships. Now, this does not necessarily mean that everything was happy, as the Happy Parliament described, but ultimately it just shows that, for the most part, Parliament was particularly in conflict quite a lot with a lot of these Stuart monarchs. And fundamentally, this is a theme that we see throughout all of the lessons that we have done on James I, and it's a theme that we see throughout the lessons looking at Charles I as well. So Charles inherits ongoing conflicts with Parliament, and these ongoing conflicts are primarily over financial matters, as well as the extent of the royal prerogative, and the extent at which Charles is able to wield the royal prerogative in a variety of different ways. There are also, of course, foreign policy issues which feed into the financial strains. So to fund military campaigns, for example, especially campaigns against Spain and France, Charles resorted to the issuance of what were known as forced loans. Essentially, these were loans that were forced, in the sense that they compelled subjects to lend money to the crown, and they did so without consent of Parliament, which is, of course, not going to go down very well. A notable incident highlighting this tension was, of course, the Darnell's case in 1627, also known as the Five Knights case, where we see that five gentlemen were detained for refusing to pay these forced loans and sought to have release via their habeas corpus rights, but they were held in detention without trial, which, of course, exacerbated this fear and this perception of arbitrary royal authority. In terms of the second point on this screen, the idea of the imposition of martial law and the billeting of troops, essentially, to support military efforts, Charles would impose martial law, which allowed for the quartering of soldiers in private homes without the owner's consent. This practice became known as billeting or billetting, and was deeply resented, as you can probably imagine, by the populace. And it was seen as another example of the king's sheer disregard for established norms and principles that had essentially required the existence of Parliament and the consent of Parliament to implement such issues. And so when we get to the petition itself, the drafting of the petition, we have to think primarily about the major author of this of the Petition of Right, which was, of course, Sir Edward Coke, who was a former Chief Justice and a leading figure in the House of Commons. Coke and his contemporaries were, of course, very concerned about the overreach of the king, particularly the use of the forced loans and the infamous Five Knights case, exemplifying this issue. Now, drawing upon historical precedents, including that of the Magna Carta of 1215 and statutes from the reigns of Edward I through to Edward III, the petition sought to reaffirm what were seen as established rights and established principles that would curtail the king's arbitrary use of power. And so the petition had a number of different points made. I'm just going to go through a couple of them here. One of them is, of course, no taxation without parliamentary consent. The petition emphasised that levies such as taxes, tillages, or forced loans, or aids of that kind, could not be imposed without the approval of Parliament. So this idea of collecting funds through forced loans or other non-parliamentary means, the practice of granting monopolies, for example, as was the case under James, this was a practice that the Petition of Right sought to get rid of, essentially suggesting that you can't do any of these things without the consent of Parliament. In a direct challenge to the Five Knights case, the Petition of Right also sought the protection against arbitrary imprisonment. It asserted that no individual should be detained without a specific cause, which of course reinforces these basic ideas of habeas corpus. This was a direct response to the Five Knights cases, the ones who were imprisoned because they refused to pay the forced loan without parliamentary consent. We also have, of course, issues concerning the quartering of soldiers, objected to the billeting of soldiers in private homes without the owner's consent. Pretty much as simple as you like there. And then finally, the restriction on the use of martial law, which is, of course, closely linked to the previous point, condemning the application of martial law in peacetime, particularly the establishment of commissions that allowed military authorities to try and execute individuals without due process, which also was part of this broader process. So what was Charles's response then? Charles is basically being called out by Parliament and being called out by Sir Edward Coke that you can't do these things anymore. Parliament can maintain the right for these various different issues, so things concerning finances, things concerning military and martial law. You should have to consult Parliament and you should have to get the consent of Parliament in order to be able to do these. Well, Charles ultimately attempted to sidestep the issue and to sidestep the petition's implications by offering not a rejection, not an acceptance, but more of a non-committal response. And so under pressure, however, he eventually gave his formal assent to the petition. But this does not mean that he then adhered to the petition or that he then essentially accepted the basic findings of the petition and the basic principles of the petition. Instead, he would continue to practice a number of different things that were contrary to the petition. So, for example, the continued collection of tonnage and poundage, which were customs duties, again without parliamentary consent. Frustrating conflicts even more with Parliament, he would then dissolve Parliament in 1629, and then from there he would initiate a period of 11 years in which he would govern without the calling of Parliament. This is known as the period of personal rule.